It was the kind of discovery that makes even the most seasoned hikers stop breathing for a moment. In the summer of 2023, a man wandering through the dense woodlands of Shenandoah stumbled upon what looked like a concrete hatch, half buried under years of fallen leaves and moss. Inside there were notebooks, 3 of them, each signed with names that hadn't been spoken aloud in nearly a decade. Tyler Morrison, Amber Hayes, and Chris Park. 3 university students who vanished during a hiking trip back in 2014. At the time, their disappearance had shaken the small Virginia town that bordered the park. Search teams scoured every ravine, every cave, every stretch of the forest floor. Yet nothing was ever found. No bodies, no footprints leading out. Just an abandoned tent, half collapsed, with food still sealed inside, as if its owners had stepped away for a moment and never come back. Now, 9 years later, the forest was offering something back. A whisper from beneath the soil, a clue that seemed to breathe. The question wasn't just what had happened to them, but why they might have chosen never to return. When news first broke that 3 university students had vanished in Shenandoah National Park, few took it seriously. Students went missing all the time, at least for a night or two, a wrong turn, a misread map, a phone battery gone dead. But by the second morning, when no one had heard from any of them, and their car was still parked neatly by the trailhead, the tone shifted from mild concern to cold, creeping fear. The authorities responded quickly. By dawn, the park's narrow roads buzzed with activity. Police vehicles, volunteers, and news vans jockeying for space among the mist and trees. Helicopters traced wide circles overhead, their searchlights slicing through the forest canopy. K-9 units were deployed, sniffing for any trace of human scent. For days, search teams combed every inch of the terrain, ravines, stream beds, and even the abandoned cabins scattered deep within the woods. The media coverage exploded almost immediately. Local reporters arrived first, their segments filled with the usual clichés about a tight-knit community shaken by fear. But when national outlets picked up the story, it became something larger, a headline mystery that drew the eyes of the country. Photos of the 3 students appeared on television screens across the nation. Tyler Morrison, a 22-year-old environmental science major with a quiet smile. Amber Hayes, his best friend since childhood. And Chris Park, a computer engineering student known for his dry humor and love of urban legends. Together, they seemed the perfect image of youth, bright, adventurous, full of promise. But that promise vanished without a trace. On the 3rd day of the search, rescuers found their campsite. It was a strange, almost cinematic scene, a tent standing half collapsed, backpack still inside, food unopened, a small camping stove resting on a rock. Nothing had been ransacked, nothing suggested a struggle. Their phones and wallets were found neatly arranged inside one of the bags, as though someone had intentionally placed them there before leaving. And then, nothing. No footprints leading away from the site, no signs of wild animals. The search dogs followed a scent for about 50 yards into the forest before abruptly losing the trail. It was as if the 3 had simply stepped off the face of the earth. The unanswered questions piled up faster than the investigators could respond. Why would 3 rational young people walk away from their supplies? Why leave behind their phones, their only connection to help? The weather that week had been clear, not a hint of the storms that often disorient hikers. And they were experienced enough to handle the terrain. This wasn't a case of naive teenagers lost on their first outing. Rumors began to seep through the cracks of official statements. Some claimed there were strange shapes spotted in the woods the night before, moving lights, muffled voices. Others whispered that Chris had been obsessed with survivalist forums and had spoken of wanting to live off the grid. But the police found no evidence of premeditation, no note, no online trail suggesting a planned disappearance. Within a week, the operation shifted from search to recovery. Volunteers dwindled. The forest grew quiet again. The media, ever hungry for the next story, began to move on. Yet for the families, It never ended. Tyler's parents continued to visit the park each anniversary, placing flowers near the trail entrance. Amber's younger sister started a blog, uploading old photos and diary entries in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize something they'd missed. Chris's father, a retired military man, organized his own private search, convinced that local authorities had given up too easily. He spent months mapping old hiking routes, speaking to rangers, even hiring a private investigator. Every lead turned to dust. The emotional toll on the community was immense. What began as collective grief slowly twisted into suspicion. A few people whispered that perhaps one of them had harmed the others, a theory that divided the families. Police dismissed it, citing lack of evidence. But without closure, speculation thrived like fungus in the damp corners of the town's collective mind. For nearly a year, the case stayed alive through talk shows and online forums. Amateur sleuths picked apart every photograph, analyzing the grainy campsite images for hidden clues. Some claimed to spot handprints on a nearby tree trunk. Others insisted the tent had been pitched in a way that suggested panic. None of it amounted to anything. Eventually, the story faded, leaving behind only a handful of unsolved threads and a sense of unfinished business. Shenandoah returned to its quiet rhythms, the chirp of crickets, the hum of the wind, hikers passing through with polite nods and careful smiles. Yet for those who remembered the three names, Tyler, Amber, and Chris, there was always something uneasy about those woods. Every once in a while, a new hiker would mention hearing footsteps when they were certain they were alone, or finding small piles of stones arranged in odd patterns near the riverbed. Park officials dismissed these reports as overactive imaginations, the natural eeriness of the forest playing tricks on the mind, but the locals would exchange knowing looks. They'd lower their voices and say the same thing they'd been saying for years. The forest doesn't forget, it just waits. And so the case of the three missing students became another entry in the long, unsettling history of America's vanishing hikers, a story that seemed to close itself, yet left behind a chill that refused to fade. No bodies, no evidence, no answers. Just three names echoing faintly through the trees. It was the summer of 2023 when the silence finally broke. Nearly a decade had passed since anyone had spoken the names Tyler Morrison, Amber Hayes, and Chris Park in anything other than whispers or memorials. The forest that had swallowed them whole seemed to have reclaimed its calm until two hikers, both strangers to the case, stumbled upon something that would reignite the mystery all over again. They were a couple from Maryland, seasoned hikers who had veered off the established trail to explore a seldom-used path. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the moss-covered ground. That's when one of them noticed a faint square outline beneath the undergrowth, a patch of concrete that looked impossibly out of place in the middle of nowhere. Curiosity, that dangerous human instinct, got the better of them. They began scraping away leaves and dirt until a metal handle appeared, rusted and cold to the touch. The hatch opened with a sound that had no business. Echoing in the wilderness, a low, metallic groan that spoke of years sealed away from light. What lay beneath was not what anyone expected. Inside, there was a staircase, steep and narrow, leading down into darkness. The couple hesitated, their torches trembling slightly as they descended. The air was heavy, stale, as if the room itself hadn't been disturbed in years. At the bottom, they found a small, bunker-like chamber built into the earth. It was crudely constructed, but deliberate walls lined with wood and tin, a makeshift bed fashioned from old blankets, empty tins of beans stacked neatly in a corner. A faint smell of smoke lingered, mixed with damp soil and decay. It looked lived in. On a rickety table, there were objects that seemed to belong to another life entirely. A cracked wristwatch, a University of Virginia keychain, a disposable camera, and several notebooks. The handwriting on the covers was neat but faded. One was labeled October 2014, another Year 2. The last one simply said, "Ambers." The hikers didn't linger. They took photos, noted the coordinates, and left shaken, though not yet fully aware of the weight of what they'd found. When they turned the information over to park authorities, the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, the site was swarming with investigators, news crews, and a sense of unease that hadn't been felt in years. Forensic teams confirmed that the shelter had likely been occupied for several years. The condition of the objects, the dust, the rot, the layering of debris suggested long-term use rather than a recent setup. The tins had expiry dates ranging from 2015 to 2021. Someone had been here. Not briefly, not accidentally, for a long time. Inside the shelter, investigators cataloged everything meticulously. Old clothing, lantern batteries, crude tools, a fire pit built from stones, even a system for collecting rainwater through a pipe leading up to the surface. Whoever had lived here understood isolation, survival, and secrecy, but it was the journals that drew the most attention. When forensic analysts opened the first notebook, they found pages filled with cramped handwriting. It began innocently enough, the tone of young people on an unexpected adventure. Descriptions of hiking routes, sketches of trees and streams, jokes scribbled in the margins. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. There were mentions of getting lost, of food running low, of panic setting in. Then came something stranger. One entry read, "We thought we'd find our way back by sunrise, but the forest keeps turning us around. Chris says the compass is wrong. He says it's better to stay put. He says people will assume we left." Another, several pages later, was more unsettling. "It's been weeks now. We hear noises at night, but no one comes. Amber wants to leave. Chris won't let her. Tyler says we should stay until it's safe. By the Revel." Third notebook. The handwriting had begun to change uneven, trembling, lines written over one another as if the writer was losing focus. The entries referenced arguments, guilt, and something described only as the decision. The final pages were barely legible. "We're not lost anymore. We just don't belong out there. It's better here. Quiet. No eyes, no shame." When handwriting experts compared the notes to university records, the match was unmistakable. The journals had been written by Tyler, Amber, and Chris, all three. Each notebook contained overlapping entries as though they had taken turns writing about their days, their thoughts, their descent into something unrecognizable. The discovery sent shockwaves through the media once again. News anchors spoke in hushed tones about the Shenandoah shelter. Social media exploded with speculation. Were they kidnapped, brainwashed, part of some survivalist cult? Others proposed darker theories that Chris had manipulated the others, that a pact had been made, that they had chosen to disappear from society altogether. But there was one more detail that haunted everyone who read the reports. The most recent entry, written in faint pencil, was dated March 2023, just months before the hikers found the shelter. It read, "We heard voices above us again. We stayed quiet. The world doesn't want us back. No remains were ever found in or around the bunker, no DNA other than the 3 students. No signs of struggle, nothing to indicate they had died there or that they hadn't left. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a curse. They had found proof that the 3 had survived long past the time they were presumed dead, but no explanation as to why they had chosen this life of hidden confinement. For the families, it was salt in an old wound. Hope returned, cruel and fleeting. If the journals were real and every test confirmed they were, then the students had been alive, perhaps until recently. Alive and refusing to be found. Reporters called it the discovery that reopened the forest. But locals had a simpler, darker way of putting it. The woods finally spoke, and what they said only deepened the silence that followed. By the time investigators began piecing together the words inside those weathered journals, the story that had once seemed like a straightforward missing persons case turned into something far more haunting, a slow, psychological descent that blurred the line between fear and choice. What they uncovered wasn't just a record of survival, but a chronicle of minds slowly unraveling in isolation. The deeper one read, the clearer it became. This wasn't simply about 3 students lost in the woods. It was about 3 people who, somewhere along the way, decided not to come back. The early entries painted a picture of confusion and dread, isolation and fear. Tyler wrote about the first few nights after their group got separated from the main trail, how the forest seemed alive with sounds that didn't belong, how the darkness pressed against their campfire as if trying to smother it. The rain had washed away their tracks, and every attempt to retrace their steps led them deeper, into unfamiliar terrain. They still believed rescue would come. They even joked about how embarrassed they'd be once they were found, hungry and muddy, but alive. Yet, as days turned into weeks, that hope began to fracture. What had started as fear of the wilderness shifted into fear of the outside world itself. The note suggested they began to believe no one was truly looking for them anymore. The news crews had left, their families had given up, and maybe, just maybe, the world was better off forgetting. It was Amber who first mentioned staying, as if the thought of facing the world again was more terrifying than the woods surrounding them. That single idea staying seemed to grow roots of its own. The manipulation. Over time, Chris became the voice that anchored the group. In the early journal entries, he came across as calm and rational, a natural leader. But later, his words took on a darker certainty. He started speaking about purity and escape, claiming the outside world had become corrupted. He began to twist their shared fear into a sort of philosophy, that they hadn't been lost, but chosen, that the forest had freed them from the noise, the judgment, the constant pressure of living in a world that demanded too much. Tyler's handwriting, once firm, grew more erratic. Amber stopped writing altogether for several pages, her silence recorded only by the emptiness of the paper. It's chilling how easily isolation becomes control. There were no signs of physical coercion in the journals, no mention of threats or violence. But there was something worse. A psychological entanglement so deep that none of them could tell where one person's thoughts ended and another's began. Folie à trois. Psychologists have a term for this, a shared delusion between multiple people. It happens rarely, often in extreme isolation, when fear and dependency merge into belief. In their writings, the trio convinced themselves that civilization had collapsed, that by staying hidden, they were the last sane people alive. They described faint sounds in the distance, helicopters, voices, static on an old radio, and dismissed them as echoes of the dying world. It's unclear whether these experiences were hallucinations or attempts to justify their choices, but either way, they marked the point of no return. Chris's influence became almost messianic. He wrote about building a new beginning beneath the earth, away from the gaze of those who pretend to care. He scavenged materials, dug into the hillside, and constructed what he called the shelter. The others followed his lead, not out of force, but out of fragile belief. Their notebooks detailed routines, collecting rainwater, rationing food, reinforcing the entrance with fallen logs. To an outsider, it might have looked like survival. But between the lines, the truth was suffocating. This was devotion disguised as endurance. By the third year, the tone of the journals had shifted again. The breakdown. The entries became shorter, sometimes only a sentence or two, often scribbled in the margins, as if the act of writing had become unbearable. Amber's final words were written on a torn page. We were wrong. It didn't end out there, it ended in here. After that, nothing. No mention of Chris or Tyler, no trace of what happened next. The police found only remnants in the shelter food wrappers fossilized by time, a small mirror cracked down the middle, and the 3 notebooks No human remains, no sign of violence. Just an eerie stillness, as if the air itself refused to move. Forensic experts suggested they might have wandered off separately, disoriented, perhaps during winter. But the journals told a different story, one where disappearance wasn't an accident, but a decision shaped by collective delusion. It's easy, in the comfort of our homes, to think we'd never fall into something like that. But reading their words, the way logic slowly dissolved into belief, forces a more unsettling reflection. What happens when isolation convinces us that the world no longer wants us? When fear becomes a language shared between friends until it's all they can hear? That's why this part of the story lingers so deeply with modern audiences, especially those who recognize that quiet loneliness behind their screens. It's not just about 3 lost students anymore, it's about us. About the parts of ourselves that hide from judgment, that retreat when the world feels too heavy. The shelter, in a way, wasn't just built in a forest, it was built inside their minds. And perhaps that's the true horror, not monsters in the woods, but the darkness that grows in silence when no one comes to find you. To this day, no one truly knows what became of Tyler Morrison, Amber Hayes, or Chris Park. The forest that once swallowed them has long since reclaimed the traces of their lives. Every few years, hikers report strange sightings, 3 silhouettes moving through the fog at dawn, or the faint glow of a lantern deep between the trees where no path exists. Search teams have gone back, driven by these whispers, but nothing new ever turns up, just the same silence, the same sense that something or someone still lingers there. The journals ended abruptly, but the story never really did. Perhaps they wandered further into the wilderness. Perhaps they didn't survive. Or perhaps, as the most unsettling theory suggests, they chose to stay not trapped by the forest, but by their own conviction that the world outside no longer belonged to them. It's an idea that feels uncomfortably human, that when fear meets belief, escape can start to look like freedom. And maybe that's the question that will never stop echoing. What if they never wanted to be found? If this story has stayed with you, if it made you wonder how thin the line really is between losing yourself and choosing to disappear, share your thoughts below. I'd love to know what you believe happened in that forest. And if you're drawn to mysteries like this, stories that blur the border between truth and the unknown, make sure to subscribe for more tales that linger long after the final word fades.